Today I like to talk about the capacity of LiFi. And before I'm already losing the viewers who have a background in information theory, this is not the capacity of intensity modulated LiFi. Although there are many papers who describe this as the capacity, I would rather say it is an achievable throughput, because there is a way of achieving a throughput like this. And in fact, there's even a way of achieving a throughput without this 1/2. And it is exactly this factor 1/2, a factor of 2 or 3 dB differences, which are typically the very tricky things in deriving throughputs and making mathematical models for how good your system works. Well, I'm seeing a lot of papers where people go for world records on the speed of communication, and they try something else and they have some improvement of the speed, and that's worth a new paper, a new story about it. But how are we doing in theory? We are still debating about a factor of 2, where in my perception this factor of 2 should not be there in the achievable throughput. It should not be there. And I have to honestly say that even in some of my own papers, so not only many other papers that I'm seeing, but also some of our own papers, I'm seeing this factor of 2 coming up. And I will explain how I believe that that has entered the field and why I believe that maybe we should write an errata about the throughput, or at least clarify it a bit more. What is happening? Well, we can derive the rate, achievable rate, and typically that is proportional to the bandwidth. The more bandwidth, the more dimensions we have, but then also multiplied by the number of bits per dimension. And we also know that if you know from Nyquist theory that if you have a certain bandwidth, you can have 2 times the number of symbols per second. So the number of dimensions that we get is 2 times the bandwidth. And for the rate, we multiply that by the number of bits per dimension. And that's the way that you could calculate a throughput. Also in optical wireless communication with intensity modulation. And then if we calculate how many bits per dimension we could accommodate, that is typically the logarithm out of something with a signal to noise ratio. And here, if you like to read Shannon papers, everyone knows the 1948 paper that gives an expression that looks like this for radio additive wide Gaussian noise channels. But Volker Jungnickel pointed me to a 1949 paper of Shannon, where he said it's not only a theoretical capacity limit, many practical systems also behave like this. It's the bandwidth, not with a factor 1/2 there, multiplied by the logarithm of the signal to noise ratio. And why is that? If you want to have more bits, you need to create a certain distance between the signal levels, and 1 more bit requires you to double the number of symbol levels, so you also double the amplitude that you need to have, and therefore you need to quadruple the signal power. That's more or less how this signal came about, and that's also happening in an intensity modulated communication channel. But then the question should come in, should we fudge in a factor of 1/2 in optical wireless communication? And I personally believe Shannon really lived in a real world. So if we have a real channel where we have currents coming in into an LED and currents coming out of the photodiode, and we consider that channel from current to current, we have that real channel, and that 1/2 should not and does not appear in the calculations if you really do the math from scratch and do really the calculations about what this throughput is. And I've seen papers stating we use OFDM because it's spectrally efficient. Question that. But then we lose a factor of 1/2, and I certainly also question that one. Is OFDM more spectrally efficient? Well, the FFT is an orthogonal transformation from inputs to outputs, and the only thing we have to do in optical wireless communication is that we use only 1/2 of the dimensions. We want real signals, and you cannot cheat by starting with complex valued signals and then double the number of real values. So there is necessarily a factor of 2, which has everything to do with you're not changing the number of dimensions per hertz by using OFDM. So it's not more spectrally efficient. And you do not lose something in terms of dimensions by using Hermitian symmetry kind of properties. Now, why do we have this factor of 1/2 then in here in some of the expressions? And I think that is coming from researchers with a view on laser communication, where we have a spectrally very sharp carrier. And as soon as you start to modulate with an intensity, it is just like AM radio. We have an upper sideband and we have a lower sideband. So on the spectrum, in the optical domain, we have double the bandwidth of the modulation. So this 1/2 can be defendable, provided that the bandwidth that you put up there is the bandwidth in the optical domain, not in the electrical end-to-end domain, in the optical domain. But is the optical spectrum in LiFi really relevant? Let's think about LEDs. One LED has a huge, very wide spectrum. Certainly, if it is a white LED with all the phosphors, it covers the entire light spectrum. So that spectrum is much, much larger than any modulation could do. And you don't want to put in the bandwidth of the entire light spectrum and say that is the capacity of LiFi. If we're only modulating the intensity and we are limited by the speed of the LED, by the modulation speed of that LED. So, in those systems, I would really recommend to talk about bandwidth end-to-end electrically and to take out this 1/2. If you want to read more details, we have a paper about this, published around 2020. It is a comparison of MPAM versus OFDM, and there we also explain a bit more in detail what is happening if we do that orthogonal rotation and that we are not losing half of the dimensions because of Hermitian symmetry. And the number of dimensions before and after the FFT are just exactly the same. Secondly, we talk about the signal-to-noise ratio and the throughput that can be achieved there. And we derive that expression, and we don't get that 1/2 in there. And yes, indeed, we got the feedback, throw that part all out, because it is all known. Yeah, but we defended that is, we like to keep that in the paper. Why? Because we saw so many papers where suddenly this 1/2 was coming up, where I wasn't too sure that that is correct. Now, I would like to leave that discussion further to you, and I would certainly invite you to carefully check the derivation and see how you want to proceed on that. But it is also a gentle remark, a gentle comment on the community. To the information theory people, well, if you see an expression with a bandwidth times a logarithm 1 plus signal-to-noise ratio, don't immediately say it is not valid for intensity modulation, but carefully also read the 1949 paper of Shannon, where he says in many other channels it's also a structure where we have a bandwidth multiplied by the logarithm of a signal-to-noise ratio. And then also see that if you just look into a bit rate that goes to 0, then how many bits per second we can get as throughput, and then you can derive exactly the same expression. Now, if you're not coming from information theory, then certainly be very careful with using the word capacity. Rather use it, rather call it an achievable throughput, because it can be achieved and no one can comment on that. And be a little bit careful with falling in the trap, which some information theory guys say, the beginner's mistake is that you miss a factor of 2 or a 3 dB somewhere in the equations. And certainly in optical wireless communication, that is a very tricky thing. It's so easy to miss out on a factor of 2. If you want to achieve a world record, going twice as fast, having twice the bandwidth, would be a huge step forward. And that would certainly be worth a publication. Now, in our theoretical developments, it's a little bit strange and a weird experience for me that we have to debate about a factor of 2, which could be misinterpreted in our expressions. Be my guest, go to the papers, and I like to continue this discussion. So certainly contact us, contact me if you have some further ideas or some further discussion on this topic.